and welcome to my co-panelists, Winona Byrne, who joins us from the Australia Council. She is Director of Literature. Sam Wild, Senior Manager with Arts Funding and Development at Create New South Wales, and Nicola Evans, Head of Culture, Funding and Reading Australia in the Copyright Agency. Before we just kick off, I just wanted to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on. For me, that's the lands of the Kulin Nation. I think we've also got people meeting on Gadigal land, and we'd like to pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and encourage them to be involved in this conversation that we're having today. And, you know, I'd also like to say that sovereignty has never been ceded in Australia, and we meet on their land at their discretion. So our panel's very interesting. I think Tim gave us a great introduction talking about a Victorian context, and we've got representatives from New South Wales, Australia, and a more national sort of stage here as well. So I'd like to sort of start by talking to each of our panelists, getting them to explain a little bit about their organisation really quickly and the kind of funding opportunities that they have on offer. And I think we'll start with Nicola. If you could take your microphone off, and we'll hand over to you for a sec.
Hey, thank you, and welcome everybody, and thanks for this opportunity to present to you today. So I manage the Copyright Agency's Cultural Fund and Reading Australia. As many of you will probably know, the Copyright Agency is a member-based organisation. We're a not-for-profit organisation, and we collect copyright fees for the use of copyrighted material. Our members are writers, they're publishers, they're visual artists, they're journalists, they're cartoonists and surveyors. And we just held our AGM last night. It was a virtual AGM for the first time, like everybody else. And we just announced that we've distributed just under $114 million to our members, which is a pretty significant amount of funding, or money going back to our creators. The Copyright Agency has a cultural fund, and that's what I manage. And I have about $2 million a year, and that funding goes towards writers, it goes towards publishers, it goes towards organisations working in the writing and publishing sector, as well as visual arts activities. We probably fund about 80 to 100 grants a year. The average grants are between $5,000 and $30,000. And as everyone will probably say today, the grants are incredibly competitive. You know, we receive a lot more applications than we can actually fund. But, you know, the good thing about the Cultural Fund is that our priority is to support writers and publishers and the writing sector. So I'm very pleased that, you know, a lot of our funds are directed in that way. We've got some new opportunities coming up for next year as a result of COVID. And actually in the first half of the year, we had an extra $500,000 in grants for emergency funding that went to support about 61 new projects. So I'm just going to do a bit of a promo here, because one of the projects, I don't think you can see it, sorry, which is a shame. So one of the projects that we supported was the Fire, Flood, Plague project, which saw essays published first in The Guardian and now in a book that's coming out next week by Penguin Random House and is edited by Sophie Cunningham. For next year,
Nicola, could I just jump in? There's a bit of a buzz in the background. I'm not sure if that's something that is to do with headphones or something. Perhaps your microphone might be just rubbing on the lapel of your shirt a little.
All right.
Sorry.
Is it too loud?
Fire, Flood, Plague is too important not for everyone to hear about.
Okay, is there a buzz still now?
There is a little, sorry.
All right, sorry. I'm just going to see if I can do something. Just a minute. I'm just going to stop my video.
Shall we just move to Winona, if you're ready? Would you like to tell us a little bit about the Australia Council? And then we will have a longer discussion about our responses to COVID.
So the Australia Council is the federal arts funding body of the Australian government, but we operate at arm's length, and we administer funds to every art form through our core funding rounds. The purpose of the council is to champion and invest in the arts, and this means both writers and organisations in the literary sector via our grants program, and we currently invest about $5 million a year in literature. In terms of COVID, when COVID hit in March, we redirected a lot of our funds to the Resilience Program, which was a $5 million emergency fund for all art forms, which were smaller amounts, but for targeted activity through the COVID period. So that's now come to an end. So we're back to our normal core grants round, which we just had one close in September and another one is closing in March. But we also have a number of other sort of more targeted funds for literature. So one of those would be the Translation Fund, which just closed this week for publishers, foreign publishers to translate Australian works, but also for Australian publishers who want to translate works into English using Australian translators. So we have that kind of dual purpose there with the Translation Fund. We also had funds available, and we will have in the future again, funds available for publishers who want to travel to book fairs to pitch rights in Australian works. That's just been temporarily suspended because of the travel restrictions, of course, but in the first part of next year, we'll be opening that again, and they're $5,000 opportunities, just flat fee opportunities for all publishers to be able to access those international markets, whether they be in real life or they may have some wonderful idea for how to do that from Australia. So we've also just announced this week some new funds for what's called the Reimagine Sector Recovery Initiatives, which are specifically for projects that are partnerships, so literature partnerships or cross art form partnerships, which are to address a gap in the sector. And I can talk more about those later. And we also run, of course, the Visiting International Publisher Program, which has had to be put on hold for 2020 and 2021, but we'll be having some other activities around that, which I can talk more about later.
Okay, great. Shall we just try returning to Nicola and see how you go without headphones?
Okay, how's that?
Oh, lovely.
No buzzing. Do you know what it was? It was the fan overhead, because we're at that time of the year and, real life gets in the way, doesn't it? So I think, so yes, we had $500,000 in emergency action funding this year. And I think what I talked about was supporting 61 new projects where grants went to writers and artists and publishers and literary magazines and journals. But also one of the great projects that we supported is the Fire, Flood, Plague project, which is 25 essays by Australian writers, scientists, historians that have been published weekly as a series in The Guardian, but also then in a book that Penguin Random House is publishing on the 1st of December and edited by Sophie Cunningham. So look out for that book. It's a brilliant collection of pieces. We do, for next year, we do have some new grants, so we'll repurpose grants probably. We've sort of like refreshed a lot of what we have, particularly in light of what, the sector is going through with post-COVID and during COVID normal, really. So we've got some grants for publishers. It's publishing industry career development grants. They're for professional development, their skills development, and there are genuine opportunities for people who are working in publishing companies or freelance editors and freelancers generally to apply for these grants. It is about skills development, it's leadership, and in the past, we've had publisher fellowships, and we heard from Nathan earlier, who was a recipient of one of our publisher fellowships in 2018. So we've changed these grants slightly. They're $5,000 and they're for more professional development opportunities. We've also, through the grants for organisations, we've got You know, we do support publishers through these grants and other organisations in the writing sector more broadly. This is where literary magazines would come in for funding, prizes. We fund a lot of literary prizes. But for publishers, for next year, what we're opening it up to is that if you're looking to publish a debut author, an emerging author, poets, more poetry titles, or works generally of, you know, outstanding literary and cultural significance that are slightly outside of your day-to-day publishing, you can apply for a grant. And what we would like to see is that grant going to the commissioning fee for the writers. So it's not to offset publishing costs or printing costs. It's really, we want the money to go back to the writer. So I will talk more about these grants as we get further into the session if anyone wants more information. And as Winona has mentioned, you know, we are working together on supporting quite a couple of projects. One of them is the wonderful research that Macquarie University is doing into the international rights sales. And also we were going to be partnering with the Australia Council this year on the VIPS program. So I'm hoping we're still going to do something in that space with VIPS next year.
Thanks so much, Nicola. That's great. I've just been talking to Sophie Cunningham for our podcast about Fire Flood Plague, and it's a real cracker of a book. It's really confronting a lot of the terrible things that have been happening this year. You know, just from a very personal level to a global level. It's amazing. And also thank you, Nicola, for also supplying us with a technical glitch. It wouldn't be a session about 2020 and the pivot without someone having a technical glitch. So that's very, very, very generous of you. We might just move to Sam Wild now from Create New South Wales. Would you like to tell us a little bit about your organisation, Sam, and what you have to offer?
Sure. And I hope I don't contribute to any technical glitch. I just want to quickly acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional owners of the land which I'm currently sitting on. So Create New South Wales is the arts funding and policy body at the New South Wales government. We are a department of government. We're not arm's length. We don't have that luck that the Australia Council has. So very much our program is delivered and under the sort of decision making of the Minister for the Arts, the Honourable Don Harwin. We, apart from our policy work and development work that we support through various strategies, my team delivers $61 million in arts and cultural funding. That includes core funding for the Sydney Writers' Festival and the recent edition of the Byron Writers' Festival as one of our key festivals. We have in the last 2 years established a literature board as the advisory and assessment committee for our grants that come through our competitive rounds. That's chaired by Jennifer Byrne, and we have a full list on our website of who the members of that board are. They're in their second year now and really settling into their purpose of assessing our grants, and it's been a really interesting and exciting process working with Jennifer on that, on those decision making. And I guess through our funding, while we don't get a huge amount of literature grants applicants through our competitive rounds, we do through our small project grants. So we have quick response up to $5,000 grants that we assess and notify clients about within a 3-week period. And we get a lot of writers who apply through that. Every batch that we do, which we do batches of every 3 weeks, we get writers applying, and it's a really probably the most accessible and easiest way for individuals who are not connected to an organisation can come to us to get a grant to take time to write or attend conferences or workshops or any professional development component. Last year, we established Write North, which is a residency program that we're delivering in partnership with Byron Writers. And that's a residency of a week-long time up in the beautiful Byron area. And that was fabulous. Charlotte Wood led a facilitated workshop program with a group of three writers during that whole week. And the feedback we got from those writers was that it was one of the best experiences they had. That was Nigel Featherstone came back to us with that feedback. So it was a really positive experience, and we're going to be looking to continue that program. We're also going to be working with State Library on a First Nations placement residency program, and we're really looking forward to how that develops. It hasn't been announced yet, so I can't go into the details. We have got some new initiatives for literature in our restart package, but I think, George, you want to talk about the COVID kind of not using that word, programs in a next kind of bit. But if that gives you a sense of who we are, we do have dedicated arts workers who work with us within our team, and yeah, I think that probably covers what we do.
I think we're all trying to avoid the P word, pivot, today. But look, if somebody does it, we'll just cop it. I think people play bingo at Zoom conferences at the moment to see how many times they hear that terrible word. And Tim's just said that we did pivot yesterday too in a session. But yeah, it's interesting talking about how COVID has had such a huge impact. And I think a lot of funding bodies have moved very quickly to change what they're doing. You know, you mentioned sort of international publishing program, publisher coming to Australia programs obviously have to shut down very quickly. I think Charlotte Wood reflected at the parliamentary inquiry that, and it was a little bit of an anecdotal evidence, that she said 90% of book sales at launch events fall away because we're doing it via Zoom. You know, normally you'd show up to book launch, you would buy a book. And I think for smaller publishers, the book launch is a great point to gather a community around a book, people who've written for it, people who are friends and family who will buy 4 or 5 copies. So, you know, I wonder if looking at some of the programs that you've got, if we could look at some of those that might help smaller and medium term publishers to adapt to what's been a very difficult year, and you know what might continue to be a difficult year next year as we try and live with COVID and look at less international travel. So did someone want to start there? That's a monster question.
I feel like Create's probably not the best one to talk to this, because while we're now open to publishers to consider applying to us, it's not a field that we've always worked in. But I did want to just comment, George, that it's interesting what's happening in the publishing field and the booksellers field, because the commercial gallery sector has just taken off during this period. They can't produce enough work or sell enough work. So yeah.
And some of them have pivoted really effectively too, Sam. I think, you know, the gallery sector has gone, well, we're all about direct care. We're selling things from a website, you know, a lot more. And I think for publishers, there's always been a bit of a challenge to refer people to bookstores. And some bookstores have moved really well online. Some bookstores haven't. And I wonder if some publishers have seen a lot more direct contact with their customers as well. That's more of a comment, but Winona, I think maybe you would like to speak to this one.
Well, I was just going to follow up what you were saying there, is that, you know, and I'm sure it's been covered elsewhere over these past 2 days, that, you know, people are reading more during COVID, which is fantastic. So the sales are up, as was presented in your BookScan session yesterday. But, you know, that's not for everyone. You know, that's really only just... well, it seems like the big names or writers with a platform, an existing platform, are selling very well, but it has been really hard for debut writers, which is why I think the Copyright Agency's particular focus on that next year with the work that they're doing is fantastic. I mean, we're a little bit different, I guess, in the Australia Council, in that our core grants rounds are kind of set now, so we don't have that ability to be quite as nimble as perhaps a Copyright Agency and others can be. But the new Reimagine sector recovery initiatives, which are open to individuals and organisations, is an attempt to do that. It's an attempt to address particular challenges that COVID has raised over the last 6 to 9 months.
I think, Nicola, you were speaking of this idea of the class of COVID, the people who are debuting or, having maybe a very early career book out now, and how they're being impacted by, COVID and perhaps not getting the hurrah that they would normally get for their books.
Yes, I think so. I think, when we see all the books that have been published from about March onwards, really, it's just been an incredibly competitive field to get any publicity, to, raise your head above water, really, because there's so much, going on in the online space at the moment. I really feel for all the debut authors who, whose work was published in this period of time. And I know that, bookshops and, publishers have done a great job in promoting them, but it's not the same as if you could go along to one of their book launches, for instance. So I think, probably for us, what we probably look at for next year is that if you've got publishers who are thinking of publishing more debut writers, then, they may be able to come to us, with an application where they apply for the writer's fee, for instance. So that's one way of addressing what's happened this year, to some extent, by providing a little bit of support for that writer, for next year. I was just going to say then, the online space has also changed everything for everyone. Everything is online, all the conferences, all the, everything is online, book, everything. Launches, we've all done, so many launches, and you start to enjoy them. I mean, you're starting to enjoy attending Writers' Festival events in that online webinar space as well. So I mentioned our career development grants for people who are working in publishing. So given that there has been a dramatic shift to online, I would imagine some people might be looking to acquire new skills, or to enhance their skills, or to build on their skills. And if they're working in publishing in some capacity, then they might be able to apply for one of our grants in that respect. And that, I think, could really benefit some of the smaller publishers too.
It's interesting, that skills conversation too, about how so many people are looking to open up their skills now and say, what else can I do? And I'd probably just underscore also your point about Zoom conferences and digital sessions like this. Something that perhaps urban Australians don't appreciate is how much, regional and remote Australians are now able to participate because it's digital. I was speaking to someone who wanted to attend a conference, and they said, it's $700 for me to attend that conference. I have to get a flight, I have to get a hotel, I have some access needs as well. So, all of a sudden someone finds that attending a conference like this is $700 cheaper for them, and is so much more available. And someone, Gillian Kennedy, has said, I'm here from Broome today. So, I think a lot of people probably are, attending today who might not have been able to. So it has been a good opportunity. I don't want to be too Pollyanna and say what a wonderful pandemic, but, there have been some things that it has opened up. I wonder if anybody else has any other observations about things that have been positive out of this pandemic.
Sorry, Sam, did you want to?
No, you go.
I think what it's raised for everyone in the arts, and this is broader than just the literary community, is, it has opened up new ways of doing things, but it's also thrown up perhaps a few things that we have been wanting to change for a while, but haven't quite had the impetus or time or motivation or, thinking space to be able to do. And so, the way that some of those festivals are now producing some fantastic content that's available online, podcast or digital series with writers that you would only get to see if you went to the festival. Now you can have access throughout the year. So I think there's been some opportunities like that have been really positive. I think that it's also thrown up challenges around, particularly in response to the Black Lives Matter movement and the ensuing conversations that we've had in Australia about First Nations history. There's been, you know, some really wonderful books that have been promoted beautifully by our booksellers on these topics and are selling really, really well to a growing cohort of Australian readers who want to find out more. So I think books by diverse writers are, you know, finding a ready audience now. So that's
Right.
particularly just COVID related, but about 2020, you know, and having all these things kind of come at once.
Yes, yeah. Sam, I think you've got something to
Oh,
add, and Nicola after that.
And I think that all I can add is really building on what Winona just said, is this access, and the access by really eager audiences in Australia to international content as well as Australian content across the whole country. With same reflection that accessibility has been a real limitation for a lot of people to attend festival events or talks, and Art State, which was held in Wagga a couple of weeks ago, was exactly that, where you were able to have somebody presenting who was on a screen, on a really big screen. There was a dedicated level of technology given to that space as well, and I think the quality of the presentations will improve as the need occurs. But on the flip side of that, and I know you just said positive things, but on the flip side of that is the challenges around the competing with that quality that could possibly be presented, where other countries may invest more money into the quality of the presentations, be it performance or conference presentations, but also how we keep our stories from New South Wales or Australia, you know, at the forefront when we're being bombarded with all this international content, which may kind of, you know, how do you filter through and get access to the stories that, you know, are unique to Australia?
I would agree there as well. You know, I think what the pandemic has shown us is that we've re-engaged with reading, to be honest, as well, and it's raised the profile of reading as well. It's raised the profile of writers and the importance of the arts generally, you know, to us all. And it's highlighted, you know, a lot of the deficiencies in funding, you know, in particular. And there's an inquiry, you know, that so many people have made a submission to, but that's the bigger picture of the arts. I think, you know, for the writing, publishing industry, there are opportunities. There are, you know, as we've talked about, you can actually now attend an event online. For the first time ever, people have been able to attend the Miles Franklin Literary Award. You know, it demystifies what goes on at an awards ceremony in a way. So it's a bit more egalitarian. If you want to go, you know, you can, it's there for everybody. You know, that I think getting good, you know, writing out to, you know, greater audiences is just so important. As part of our emergency funding grants this year, we gave a grant to Sydney Writers Festival. It was right at the time that the pandemic, you know, was declared. And we'd just been to the program launch for the Sydney Writers Festival the night before or something. And I think what happened is that they said that, you know, they couldn't go on, and then we gave some emergency funding to the festival and to a lot of the writers' festivals around the country, actually, to enable them to create these podcasts, you know, that I know, you know, they've been viewed by, you know, 5,000 people in a lot of cases. So there's that real appetite there. So I think those are the sorts of opportunities, I think, for publishers and also for the writing sector, really, to embrace the digital as well as doing, you know, what you do and what you do really well. There are opportunities for funding, you know, just have these conversations with the people and find out where the best fit is, to be honest.
That's Writers' Festivals have been a really good adapter, I think, in some ways. The Yarra Valley Writers' Festival down here in Victoria had, I think it was their first or second year, but they moved entirely online and found themselves, you know, finding a new audience across Australia, but also internationally, and kind of have a regular writers kind of week now almost, and have got a great community that they're sort of building. And I know that Sydney Writers Festival was the same, and Melbourne Writers Festival, lots of people sort of picked that up. I think that the bigger people have been able to adapt, really easily, but I think it was Winona's point earlier that, some of the big sales that we're seeing might not be translating for some members of SPN, as they're sitting there thinking, well, yep, Andy Griffiths is doing okay this time. But, it's the class of COVID people who are missing out that, authors who are debuting a book now. Nicola, I think you've got something to say though.
No, just the fact that SPN members, if you are looking at publishing, a new debut author, just have a look at the information on our website. It is through the grants for organisations. It'll be a closing date at the end of April next year. We've just yesterday, in fact, updated this information on our website. So it'll close at the end of April with a decision then in early July. Bear in mind, there's going to be a lot of competition. So what I would encourage you to do is probably email me beforehand and let's have a chat about what you're thinking of doing. But essentially you could apply there for support to commission the writers. It doesn't replace your royalty agreement or your advance that you're going to give, but it's another way of us supporting writers, and also there's a guaranteed publication of that work as well, which is so important really these days.
Right. We will also try to make time for some questions from the audience too by going into the Q&A function. I can see one or two sort of questions sort of popping up there already, but we'll get to those at the end. Nicola, I think you touched on something really interesting much earlier, talking about how the Copyright Agency is much more about commissioning writers. They don't want to have too many things in an application that are going to prevent writers from getting money. And that's obviously a bit of a pet peeve for you. I'm wondering if in applications and submission processes, Winona and Sam, if you have anything that is a real turn off, close the door, or one of those shibboleths, one of those things that you see and you go, this is going to open up an application with us much more effectively. Sam, I can see you've switched off your microphone first, so you're in first.
Oh, I didn't mean to do that, Winona. But paying artist fees is a key one, and not referring to industry rates is the other concern. So establishing why and how you justify what you're paying a group of writers or artists is incredibly important and is looked at closely. Probably the key problem is where people write for the application or the grant round rather than for the project they're actually delivering. The people assessing these grants are actually looking for that passion, that what why you want to do this, how you're going to do it, like the excitement. They're less looking for how you're going to pushing something into this grant model. And while being state government, we do appreciate that our funding model is still quite bureaucratic, and we try to work on it all the time to loosen up those boundaries. There is still an opportunity for people to talk about that passion and their love of what they're doing. And I think that finding a way of achieving that in a balance of addressing the actual questions is probably something that we'd love to see more of. But writers' fees, just to speaking to what Nicola was talking about, is that our COVID response has all been about pay artists. So we've just released sort of over $30 million in restart money to the New South Wales arts and cultural sector, and all of it, pay artists their fees. It's really important.
I guess one thing to remember is that the people who are assessing your application are from the literary sector, writers themselves in many cases, or have run organisations, or might be publishers. So they have an idea of how it works. And if there's a big gap there in your application, either it's not clear how writers are going to benefit, or it may be an application where readers are going to benefit or audiences are going to benefit. You need to be really clear about what is the benefit to writers or readers or the sector. And also I guess, pet peeves, if you wanted to go there. Is that what you're asking, George, for pet peeves? would be organisations that perhaps make lofty claims that are not substantiated or that people can pick holes in. Don't make claims like we are the only publisher who publishes this kind of work, unless you know that absolutely that is 100% correct, because the people in the room are from the sector, and if they start to get these kind of red flags, then it brings into question other things. The other thing I would just recommend is that people be really careful with their budgets. And by that, I don't mean that they have to have everything down to the dollar, but just be really clear. Where's your income coming from? If you are doing a 1,000 copy print run and you're applying for funding to help pay the author, you need to actually include the income, or that even if it's unconfirmed, no one knows how many books are going to sell, but just as an idea and as acknowledgement that, you will be getting some income from that as well, whether it's in kind or actual, and you need to make that clear in the budget. Budget questions pop up all the time, and our grants team are here to help people work through those, because sometimes budgets can really nobble a good application, and it's a shame.
And is it important for those budgets to also capture some of those in-kind costs, the investment of the publisher for their time, for their
yeah, I mean, you may not want to go into every sort of photocopied page detail on that, but I think it's reasonable to outline the investment that the small publisher, is making in order to get that book out to readers. So yeah, I think in kind is really important to make that clear, and because assessors want to see that you've got some skin in the game as well, and that's an easy way of proving that.
Nicola, did you have something to add there?
Just to say, I completely agree with what Sam and Winona have said, and also just on budgets, very important, but they should balance, they should balance on paper at the very least. So I really encourage people, when they put in an application, income must equal expenditure, and that's your opportunity to add in your in-kind contribution. And I was just going to add a pet peeve, I think, for me, for us, is, if you're applying for a grant and it's a project-based grant, don't put in don't take an excerpt from your strategic plan with your goals and KPIs for a year. We don't want to see all of that in a project-based application. They're fine when you're going for 3-year funding and more strategic funding, but don't put in your dot points, goals and KPIs. It's taking up space. Just be clear and passionate about the project that you'd like support for.
Okay, so we've got some really good suggestions there around not pushing something into a box that it doesn't belong into grants-wise. I think you also sort of said be careful about budgets, which I think, given that we're saying some of us are probably familiar with one part of our brain and not the other, the creative part might be coming into the accounting part sometimes. So making sure that revenue and expenditure balance well is important. The other one I had was avoid our lofty claims, and let's just keep these strategic plans where they are and use our words effectively, because I think the people on those boards assessing those grants often don't have a lot of time, so they just don't want to sort of go through all of that waffle, and they need something that's clear, impactful writing that's going to convince them. Winona?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, any kind of academic or formal language really doesn't go down well with the panel. They like you to use,
So footnotes, they're okay? Lots of footnotes?
Avoid all of those things, while the panel will be wordsmiths and very curious about words. We don't want to have to send them off to look up certain terminologies or academic language. So yeah, just keep it simple and try and convey that passion and talk about your track record. That's the other thing too. Make it really clear what you do well. And if you're deviating from that in the project application, that's totally fine. But talk about how you're going to make the switch then from what you usually do, whether it's, publishing poetry, and then you're going to make the switch to nonfiction, for example. How are you going to reach those writers? How are you going to reach those readers? That's really important.
I also just, and I think, Nicola, I'm probably guilty of that cut and pasting of the strat plan and things. I'm probably doing that really because if I'm making a grant application, it's difficult to kind of isolate the time to do that. So, and I'm sure for a lot of small publishers, it's the same case, it's the same situation where they can't say, okay, I'm just going to block out a day or 2 days or, you know, however long it's going to take me. And I know that some people go down the road of employing an agency or an individual to write a grant for them. I wonder if you could talk about the pros and cons of that from your perspective.
Can I go first? Because I just unmuted myself. Look, I'm not a fan of you know, the professional grant writer. If you're an individual, if you're a writer applying for a grant, partly because you, if you're a peer, you're reading 100 or so applications. If you've got a grant writer, there's a sameness to those applications. So the original voice doesn't come out. Your passion is not conveyed. There's a bit of a sameness, and you can spot it, you know. So I think if you're a writer applying, you know, for a grant to write a project, use your words. If you're an organisation, be careful, because what you don't want to lose is, you know, your passion, your ideas, because, you know, there's a certain uniformity in grant writing. Some are better, some grant writers are better than others, but you can see, you tend to spot them as well. That's probably what I would say there.
Any other thoughts on professional grant writers?
I would just echo Nicola's.
Oh, Sam, you just seem to be a little off mic.
Can you hear me now? Okay. I would just echo Nicola's thoughts. Sorry, it's not going to be very illuminating. I think that's right. I think that you lose a lot of that kind of uniqueness for grant writers, and we don't see a huge level of success through that approach. That's not to say that we may be unaware that some of our best applicants are using grant writers and we're not aware of it because they're working closely with the client, so that passion is coming through. It's just that someone's helping them understand how to address each criteria.
And I think nobody knows you like you, really. It's you know your advantages, you know what you can do and what you can't do. And I think for smaller publishers, sometimes the ability to understand yourself and what you can offer is part of that grant writing process. I actually say to people, sometimes if you can't get through the grant process, you shouldn't be applying. You know, if you feel like you're cramming something into one of those boxes, Sam, that doesn't quite fit, then, you know, maybe that's the point where you should self-select out of applying for a grant. Just wanted to give everyone a bit of a nudge to see if they want to put anything in the Q&A box. I can see some of those are quite one-off questions that Tim's jumped in and answered for us. Where's a link, something like that. But I'm really conscious that I can't ask all of the questions of this panel that you probably want answered, SPN members. So let me know if there's anything else you would like to ask here. We seem to have no questions asked at the moment, so I might just keep wrapping
I've got a question, George, if you don't mind. Don't you love it when panelists start trying to host the event? But I just have a question from Sam, because you mentioned before, Sam, that you don't get many applications was that in the organisations round that you were talking about there? And I wondered why.
Oh, I love the fact you asked that question, because I wanted to ask if I could do a little bit of a sort of push to say we would love to see more applications coming from particularly small press publishers, because it's an area that we don't get the applications. I think that we haven't been seen as an organisation that is accessible for literature clients, for publishers. We used to have limitations on for-profit organisations applying to us. We've removed those. You can, but you just need to be clear about where that government funding is going to go. We're not, you know, it just has to be very clear it's going to the writers, or it's going to actually deliver the programs. But I think that for some reason, I think that it's very hard for government departments to be seen as accessible, and we're trying to turn that around. But I'd be very keen to see, particularly publishers who are publishing writers from diverse backgrounds. It's a real gap for from us in terms of what we fund. and we get that feedback. And I think it will come. I mean, I've been having a few conversations with the consultant for Australia Council, that recent consultancies and that you've been doing. And I think this is an area that we really need to strengthen our offer from Create, and I imagine across the board, around how we support writers to get published who are from culturally diverse backgrounds, but also our First Nations people.
Did anyone have any other questions to ask each other? I didn't want to, you know.
I was going to ask, so we all had some emergency funding this year, and, you know, we all put various amounts into the emergency funding, but I think probably we all received a tremendous number of applications. I was just wanting to get a sense of the numbers of applications that came in, you know, to you, if you've got these numbers, particularly from writing and the publishers. For us, we had about 450 applications, and we supported about 61 of those applications. Do you know those sort of numbers for you both offhand?
How many applications we had in the resilience grants? It was over 7,000 applications across all art forms, though. I don't have the success rate for literature, but it was fairly even, I've got to say. So I think the $5 million was spent. In fact, I think it was slightly overspent. But I think what appealed to people applying for that resilience fund, and this is something that we're sort of taking back and thinking about for the future and how our grants might better serve the needs of the sector, is that because they were smaller amounts, they were more targeted. There was less pressure on the application process because we really wanted to be able to help people quickly. So there was no deadline. It was just a rolling deadline. And that flexibility, I think, allowed people who maybe wouldn't apply normally to the Australia Council give it a go. And we had a huge percentage, and I think it was, I want to say something like 40% of applicants had never applied to the Australia Council before. So it was actually a real eye-opener, and I think something that we're trying to learn from to see how we can, you know, apply that in future.
Our money, we did have a small rounds of COVID initiatives that we offered around, I think it was in April, May time. It was really quick, short turnaround period because we had to spend it in the financial year. We got about 500 applications, but again, they were small. They were $10,000 grants. Some of them were targeted at First Nations. So, you know, but I don't have the literature results for that. But the $50 million Rescue Restart money that we offered as a stimulus, not as a grants round. So there was a certain amount, the first sort of half of that was around rescue. So it was about working with individual clients who were about to fall over. But we've just released the big amount, and that went to our funded clients and was based on a turnover amount of what they had. So it was literally any multi-year funded, annual funded arts and cultural organisation that we were currently working with got some stimulus. So we saw Writing New South Wales, Varuna, South Coast Writer Centre, Hunter, all those sort of clients that get program funding from us are getting some money, you know, varying amounts. Sydney Writers Festival, Byron Writers. What was exciting about that is they gave us some small amount, 2.5 million, to run strategic initiatives, and a component of that, almost $1 million, is going to be spent on writing initiatives. And where we've consulted with all the writers' centres that still exist, and a few festivals that are in areas that don't have a writers' centre, to talk about what we could offer in terms of opportunities that will pay writers in the next 6 months. So that's yet to roll out. We're just about to finalise that process, but it's been a really fantastic opportunity to talk about, like, working with Writing New South Wales and Diversity Arts Australia about a diversity program, and we're looking at a lot of the models of what Creative Victoria have offered and the Wheeler Centre, because they've been offering some really significant programs that we do look at with a lot of interest. We're also working with Accessible Arts and Varuna. Now Varuna's just opened its accessible studio at the house, and we're looking at how we could run a program with them for artists with disability. And then we're talking to I always pronounce it incorrectly, but the First Nations writing group, Fawn,
Yeah.
And to talk about how we could deliver a First Nations component. So we've been lucky to have this bit of strategic money, but we haven't done it through a competitive process.
Great. Unless anyone else has anything to add on that one, I've got just a question from Susan Caroli, who wants to know what would be an appropriate funding source for small writers' festivals, please? I think you were just mentioning some there, Sam, so perhaps there might be some people who'd like to jump in there. I'd probably preface this by saying size of small might vary quite a bit, but some smaller festivals may even be looking at a local council for support, who often have great arts programs and can supply things like a community centre as an in-kind support, but perhaps for your larger organisations.
Well, we do fund small writers' festivals across New South Wales. So we funded Mudgee Readers Writers. We've provided funding to Bellingen Writers Festival at times. So our project round is it would actually absolute project round. You can apply either to literature or festivals funding, and it can be small amounts of 20,000, or it can be larger amounts of 100,000. So it has a broad range. There's no cap on how much you can apply for, but you just have to kind of be realistic and look at what's being funded before, and noting we have a limited budget ultimately.
Suzanne has just updated that question to say that she's looking at about 100 writers. So perhaps.
I just wanted to add, I mean, you can apply to the Australia Council as well. We do support festivals. We have our success rates are such that we haven't been able to support all the writers' festivals that we would have liked. But one bit of advice I would give people if they were applying for festivals is that I think everyone knows writers as chairs are paid a very, very low amount for doing what can be hours and hours and hours of reading preparation and preparation for hosting a panel session. And we would love to see festivals lift that rate from what I believe is about $220 upwards to reflect that time and expertise that writers bring to those positions.
Here, Winona, chairs should be paid more. I'm just wondering if we have any other questions there. I think that might have answered the question about writers' festivals. And Suzanne is saying that her festival is distinctly for writers, not for readers. So she's really looking at something that I think would be quite focused on writers, and may, given some of the answers that you've given us, be about more passing on benefits directly to artists rather than having a kind of a middle step there. I'll just see if there's any other questions, but I think there might be another response there from Sam.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a number of our writers' festivals in New South Wales, and I don't know if you're in New South Wales, but is that they want to get together to talk about shared knowledge about how they run their festivals. So Wollongong Writers Festival and Newcastle, but Byron wants to talk with other small literary festivals about how they do what they do.
That's very interesting. There was a bit of a round table, I remember, a couple of years ago, which brought people from Edinburgh who ended up working for Melbourne Writers Festival. Yeah, so they're really effective, those points where people link up. And now that we're all used to Zoom calls, we should be able to have more of those international sessions. Did anybody have anything else to add on that at all? Or? Okay, all right. Well, we're getting quite close to time. Does anybody have a final question for each other at all? Let's make sure you had the opportunity to ask yourself before I jumped in again. I was thinking about the flexibility of the grant process as well. So you touched on this a little bit, but I think one of the things that people have probably enjoyed about the COVID imperative is that the submission process has been simplified for a lot of things. You know, there's a feeling that there's less paperwork, faster assessment times and things like that. I wonder how, from inside organisations, that's been experienced. I imagine it's a very big cultural change, and in some points it's been easier and in some points it's been harder. Winona, you've jumped in there.
Oh, well, I was just going to say it is hard, and I don't expect, you know, getting the tiny violin out here, you know, I know it's much tougher on the other side, but it's very hard for organisations such as the Australia Council to run those really quick response grants, because, you know, your closing date is every day, and you're getting so many inquiries all the time, and it's very difficult. It's quite difficult to keep those rolling assessments going. So I guess we haven't adopted that as a permanent model, but I do agree that it's something we can learn from. And I think we are trying, for example, to make our whole application process a little more friendly to people who perhaps aren't as skilled at writing grants. Maybe they want to do a video presentation and apply, you know, in that way. So we're looking at changing those models to make it a little more accessible for people also who have perhaps disabilities or English is not their first language, or whatever that might be, whatever their requirements are.
Yeah, I mean, it's an endless challenge to try and simplify the forms and yet provide enough information to the assessors for them to assess what has been asked for, and also to report back, because it is, for us, it's government money, and we are required to provide a certain amount of information, also about how many you apply, not just the successful ones in the end. But we are trying very hard to find ways that we can make it simpler. We are listening to the sector around this, and the same thing, looking at video connections. We did that. We did a music fellowship last year where we allowed the applicants to put a video to their answers to certain sections, and it worked incredibly well. We got a lot of applications, and we got a lot of the assessors were going, this is great. I really get a sense of what the artist wants, but also recognizing not everybody wants to present to video either. So we've got to get a balance. But yeah, we do care, but it's hard.
Nicola, we've probably got time for a very quick response. We're just getting to the end of our time.
Yeah, okay. So I think, you know, we've all learned lessons from, you know, how to do grants this year. It was an enormous amount of work for all of us, but I think we all did it, and we did it really, really quickly, you know, because it was so important to get the money out. But for next year, you know, what you have to manage is that process, because if you are opening up grants and you're hoping that, you know, writers, for instance, will apply, and these grants are assessed by our peers, you know, when you get hundreds of grant applications, you've got to give peers the time to read these applications. So that actually does add to the process a little bit. But, you know, there are lessons for us all this year, and certainly we've all done assessments via Zoom, and I think that's probably something we're going to continue with for next year in some capacity anyway.
Thanks so much. We are just about at time. I think I'm going to just throw to Tim in a second, but I just wanted to thank Nicola, Winona and Sam for their time. Thank you to the audience too for being generous with your questions, and we had better let you all get back to assessing grant applications and ideally giving SPN people more money. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.